let's jump right in today. We're doing a deep dive into a legal case, Santi v. Hot and Here, Inc. It's a 2019 U.S. District Court opinion, and it's really fascinating stuff, trust me. We're talking about employment law gone wrong with twists you wouldn't believe.
Yeah, it's really a case about how work relationships can get so complicated, especially when things go wrong. We're going to be looking at all sorts of legal issues, from discrimination and retaliation to even some really interesting ethical dilemmas.
Definitely. This isn't your typical boring contract case. This one gets into some, well, sensitive territory with allegations of a pretty bad, toxic workplace.
Right. So to give everyone some background, the case involved Christina Santi. She's a black woman who worked for a hip-hop media company called Vlad TV for almost 7 years. She did pretty well there, too, moving up, getting raises, and even becoming a salaried employee.
So what went wrong? It sounds like she was on the right track.
That's where things get interesting. Santi is suing not only the company, but also 2 of the executives, a husband and wife, actually. It's like a real David versus Goliath kind of thing.
Wow, okay, I see where the drama is coming in. But what's she suing them for exactly?
Her lawsuit brings up a bunch of legal issues. She's alleging overtime pay violations, discrimination based on race, gender, and pregnancy, and even retaliation. And each of these claims, has to meet certain legal standards. She needs to show the court she has enough evidence to prove her case.
Okay, let's unpack that a little. What would that evidence look like? What does it all really mean?
Sure. So for discrimination cases, proving your case means showing that the employer treated you unfairly, specifically because of your race or gender or other characteristics that are protected under the law. In this case, for example, Santi says she was pressured to post content that, played into negative stereotypes about black people, even though she wasn't comfortable with it. She's saying that this pressure, along with other things that happened, shows a pattern of discrimination.
That's a tough situation to be in. What would you say to people listening who might be in a similar spot? Their boss asks them to do something that feels wrong, maybe even ethically wrong, and they're worried about their job.
Yeah, it's a really difficult position to be in. And this case highlights how there can be such a power difference between bosses and employees. Sometimes you have to really think about what could happen if you speak up and what could happen if you don't.
Definitely. And in this case, it doesn't stop there. Santu also claims her boss made totally inappropriate comments about her appearance. She even says he told her to, and I'm quoting here, get ass shots.
You're right. That specific comment plays into her argument that she was working in what's legally called a hostile work environment. Basically, it means the workplace was so full of discrimination or harassment that it created an abusive environment. And when courts are deciding these cases, they look at how bad the behavior was and how often it happened.
And I can only imagine that a comment like that from your boss would definitely make you feel like the environment was hostile, right?
Absolutely. That comment, plus the pressure to create the stereotypical content we talked about earlier, could be really important evidence when it comes to her discrimination claims.
It sounds like we're starting to get a clearer picture of what might have been going on at this company, and it isn't good. But I'm guessing there's even more to it, right?
There is. Santi also claims she was treated differently than a male colleague, that he got credit for her work and was treated better overall. She says this shows gender discrimination.
This is such a big issue, gender discrimination in the workplace. It feels like we're looking at one example of a much bigger problem.
I think you're right. And unfortunately, there's more to Santi's case. She says the harassment got worse after she became pregnant.
Oh, wow. Adding another layer of complexity.
Right, exactly. Now, pregnancy discrimination is illegal, and there are specific laws to protect women from unfair treatment just because they are pregnant or could get pregnant.
So what happened when Santi was pregnant? How did they treat her differently?
Well, she says that her bosses said things about her coming to work sick because she wanted to get paid, and even pressured her to come in during a snowstorm, even though she was worried because of her pregnancy.
That's terrible. Being pregnant is hard enough without having to deal with that kind of treatment at work.
Yeah, it's really upsetting to hear these allegations, especially when you think about the laws in place to protect pregnant employees.
And it sounds like the harassment didn't stop there. What happened with the rapper's entourage Santi mentioned in her lawsuit?
This is where things get even more disturbing. Santi says that while her boss was interviewing this rapper, someone from the rapper's entourage touched her inappropriately and made some really lewd comments to another female employee.
That brings up a big issue about the responsibility employers have to make sure the workplace is safe. It's not just about protecting employees from each other, but from anyone who comes into the workplace.
You're exactly right. Employers are legally required to do what they can to prevent and address harassment. And just having a policy isn't enough. They have to actually enforce it and take it seriously when people report issues.
So did they take Santi's claim seriously? What happened when she told them about it?
Well, according to Santi, they basically ignored her concerns. And that can be really damaging because it tells everyone that these issues don't matter and that employee safety isn't a priority.
That's awful. It's like they were adding insult to injury.
It really makes you wonder about the kind of environment they had at this company and whether they even cared about their employees' well-being.
Okay, but get this. The company didn't just sit there and take these accusations. They actually filed counterclaims against Santi.
So right, and this is where things take a crazy turn. They claim that Santi applied for a job using a fake name, Timothy Roberts, and then hired herself under that name.
Wait, she hired herself? Are you serious?
I know, right?
Yeah.
It's a bold move, and it brings up all kinds of questions, legally and ethically. If it's true, it could really hurt her case and have some serious consequences.
So now we have both sides accusing each other of pretty serious things. How does something like this even get resolved in court?
It all comes down to evidence and convincing the judge or jury about who is telling the truth. The company would need strong evidence to prove their claims, and Santi would have to respond to those claims and show that her initial lawsuit is still valid.
I'm assuming things didn't just stop there. Did Santi respond to these counterclaims?
She did. In fact, she added even more claims to her lawsuit. She says the company retaliated against her because she sued them and that they violated some laws about pay notices and minimum wage.
So she's saying they punished her for speaking out.
Exactly. Retaliation is a big deal in employment law. Employers can't do anything negative to an employee just because that employee made a complaint or was part of an investigation about discrimination or other illegal activity.
Wow, so we started with discrimination claims, and now we have counterclaims, retaliation claims, wage violations. It's a legal mess.
It really is, and it shows just how complicated these employment law cases can be. As new information comes out, both sides can change their legal strategies, which makes the whole thing really unpredictable.
Okay, we've talked about a lot here. We've got accusations of discrimination, inappropriate behavior, a shocking counterclaim, and even retaliation. It's like a legal drama.
It really is.
Right.
And while the details of this case are unusual, it does highlight the challenges many employees face when they're trying to stand up for their rights. Proving discrimination or retaliation isn't easy, especially when you're going up against a company with a lot more money and power.
That's an important point. It's easy to forget about that power imbalance in these situations.
Absolutely. And that's why things like legal aid organizations are so important. They can help even things out for employees who might not be able to afford to fight these battles on their own.
This case also raises questions about company culture. What kind of environment allows these things to happen in the first place?
You're right. It's not enough for companies to just follow the law. They need to build a workplace where everybody feels respected and safe and like they can speak up if something is wrong. That takes a real commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion at all levels.
It's like the difference between just ticking boxes and actually building a supportive environment.
Exactly. And that's where things get tough. It's not always easy to measure those cultural values or make sure people are actually living by them.
This whole case is fascinating. It's like a real-life drama with so many twists and turns.
It is. So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's imagine we're Christina Santi. Knowing what we know now, what would you have done differently if you were in her position?
Yeah, it does feel like we're seeing so many issues that people don't really talk about, you know?
That's a really good point, I think. This case shows how employment law is always changing. New laws are being written, old ones are getting new interpretations, and even what people expect in a workplace is different now. It's an area of law that really keeps you on your toes, both for employers and employees.
Makes you wonder how effective the legal system really is in these cases. It's one person against a whole company.
Right, you got to think about that. There's this power imbalance in a lot of employment disputes. That's why it's so important to have things like those legal aid organizations that can help people who can't afford a lawyer on their own.
And it's not just the law. This case makes you think about the company itself. Like, how did they let this happen in the first place?
That's so true. Just following the law isn't enough for a company, you know? They have to create a culture where everyone feels respected and safe, where they can speak up if something's wrong. That means they have to care about diversity, equity, inclusion, all of that. And it can't just be on paper.
It's that difference between just checking boxes and actually building a workplace that supports everyone.
Yeah, exactly. And that can be hard. How do you measure those things, those values, and make sure people are actually living them?
This whole case has been so interesting, like watching a movie unfold. It's crazy to think this really happened.
It really is. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to ask you something. Let's pretend we're in Christina Santi's shoes. Knowing everything we've talked about, what would you have done differently?
That's a hard one. It's easy to look back and say what you would have done, but when you're actually going through something like this, it's so hard.
It reminds us that there's no easy answer, no one right way to do things. Everyone's situation is different, and you have to weigh your options. Think about the risks and what might happen. Sometimes speaking up can make a difference, but sometimes it can make things worse.
It shows how important it is for all of us to work towards fair workplaces. It doesn't matter if you're an employer or an employee or just someone who cares about this stuff. We can all learn from cases like this.
Being informed and knowing your rights is important, and being willing to speak up if something isn't right is huge. Well, that's about it for our deep dive into this employment law case. Thanks for listening, everyone.